In this video, we'll cover our last chapter on infectious diseases, and we'll take a look at the nervous system. So a little bit of anatomy about the central nervous system, first of all. The central nervous system is going to include the brain and the spinal cord. And when we look at the brain and the spinal cord in terms of infections, we're not going to see as many types of infections as we've seen throughout the rest of the body because of the setup that we have here, because of the anatomy in surrounding the brain and spinal cord. So we have what's called a blood-brain barrier or a blood-spinal cord barrier. And this is due to the layers of the meninges that surround the brain and spinal cord. So when we look at these infections, they have to be able to get through the blood-brain barrier in order to cause disease. The peripheral nervous system is formed from all of the nerves that we have throughout the body. The nerves do not have protective meninges. They do have a covering called myelin, and this is an insulation around those nerves, much like you have the coating around electrical cords. This myelin coats the nerves and allows the transmissions, the impulses to be carried along throughout the nerves. But since the nerves don't have meninges, they don't have those tough coverings, they are more susceptible to injury and infection than the brain and spinal cord. So meningitis is inflammation or infection of the meninges, those coverings of the brain and spinal cord. And encephalitis is inflammation of the brain tissue itself. And if the infection involves both, that is referred to as meningoencephalitis. So we're going to look at several different forms of meningitis here. The first one we have is referred to as meningococcal meningitis. This is caused by Neisseria meningitidis. And this is spread through respiratory droplets. This one is scary because it can progress so quickly that death can result within just a few hours after symptoms appear. Fortunately for this one, there is a vaccination that's given to susceptible populations, like those that are living in especially close quarters, like dormitories or, military bunkhouses. IV penicillin is the drug of choice for this one. And one thing that you're going to notice with the meningitis symptoms, they're going to be fairly similar. Fever, headache, and a stiff neck. This stiff neck is going to be kind of a characteristic sign for the different forms of meningitis. What's really different about meningococcal meningitis is this petechial hemorrhaging that occurs. This is due to the disruption or the destruction of capillary membranes, and this leads to hemorrhage under the skin. So here is Neisseria meningitidis. It does exist as a diplococcus, and so you can see here the little diplococci in this smear. Fortunately, since we've had the vaccine, we've really seen a big decline in meningococcal disease incidence. So that's a good thing. Another type of meningitis is pneumococcal meningitis caused by Streptococcus pneumonia. Found in the throats in a lot of children, but not as many adults. Again, this stiff neck is one of the main signs and symptoms. And again, we have a vaccination for this one, but it is the leading cause of bacterial meningitis among young children. That used to be caused by Hib or Haemophilus influenzae type B. Before we had the vaccine for Hib, This was the most common form of childhood meningitis, and it led to a lot of complications, deafness being the number one complication that resulted from Hib meningitis. Now, neonatal meningitis is meningitis that occurs in babies up to 3 months of age. And this is caused by group B Streptococcus, abbreviated GBS. We have early onset and late onset. Early onset is within 1 week of birth. This is going to typically result really within about 48 to 72 hours after birth. And this is when the child is infected as it goes through the birth canal. Late onset disease is going to occur between 1 week and 3 months. Now, this can come from the mother, but it may come from other sources. Now, this one is one that we really didn't know a lot about. We didn't really understand exactly where it was coming from and how we could prevent it. But once we learned that group B strep can be a member of the vaginal flora in some women, we started testing for it. So now all women who are receiving prenatal care, especially in the United States, they get tested for group B strep. And if they are shown to be positive, then they are given prophylactic antibiotics during labor and delivery. And so this is going to inhibit the group B strep from being able to be passed to the child as it's being born. And you see here that early onset disease has declined by about 80% since we've started to do that. So the more women we can get that receive prenatal care and get tested for group B strep and then can receive those antibiotics during delivery, the more we can prevent this from happening. So now we're going to get to a couple of infections caused by Clostridium species. So we've already looked at Clostridium before, and we know that these are some nasty dudes. And Clostridium tetani and Clostridium botulinum are no exception. So Clostridium tetani causes tetanus, and it is due to a neurotoxin, tetanospasmin, and it leads to muscle contraction. Basically, what happens is this neurotoxin is going to prevent the reuptake of acetylcholine. And so the muscles are going to be in this constant state of contraction. In other words, the muscles really can't relax. And it first kind of starts with the head and neck region, and it gave its old name lockjaw, because the person would basically, their jaw would be very clenched. What happens is that a person will breathe in and then they die because they can't breathe out. They can't get that diaphragm to contract so that they can breathe out. However, with tetanus, we've had a vaccine against this one for a really long time. It's part of the Tdap or DTaP vaccine, and then it's given. If you have an injury and you haven't had a booster in a while, usually within 3 or 4 years, they'll go ahead and give you this. So even with treatment, mortality rates approach 50%. But again, with the vaccine, we don't really have to worry about this one as much. So the Clostridium species, of course, are spore formers, and they are terminal spore formers. And so that's what you're seeing here in this gram stain. And then in this enhanced image here, you're seeing these terminal endospores. Here's an individual that is having these muscle spasms, these contractions, and it can lead to what's called Apistotonos, which I thought I had a picture, but I guess I don't. But individuals, I think there's one in your textbook, they get this arched back that's called Apistotonos. Basically, their back becomes so severely arched because they can't relax those muscles. Again, with the advent of the tetanus vaccine, you can see here that we have very, very few cases of tetanus reported each year. Now, neonatal tetanus is more prevalent in developing countries. Basically, what happens is a baby is born in very unsanitary conditions. They're exposed to soil, which is where these endospores live, and they will be introduced into the neonate. And particularly if the mother is not immunized, because if the mother's immunized, then the baby is going to get some of those antibodies. But mortality rate approaches about 90% in infants. And so here you can see these babies are experiencing Apistotonos. You've got this towel kind of rolled up underneath their back, kind of supporting that. But fortunately, not something we really have to worry about that much in the United States. So then we get to botulism, which is caused by Clostridium botulinum. And there are two presentations with botulism. We can have infection or intoxication. Infection is when an individual is actually exposed to the pathogen, either from a wound or from the GI tract. And once they have become infected, then the bacterium starts to produce this botulinum toxin. So wound botulism is when the pathogen is introduced directly into a wound. We don't see this very often, especially not in the United States, but where we do see it, a lot of times it's associated with IV drug users because they are using dirty needles that may contain the spores of the bacterium. Infant botulism occurs in infants younger than a year of age, and then adult intestinal toxemia, typically in immunocompromised adults. Infant botulism, lethargy, weakness, constipation. The big thing here is do not feed infants under 1 year old honey. So honey will often contain spores of Clostridium botulinum. Now, if adults eat honey, there's no problem with that because the pathogen, if it becomes vegetative again, all of the bacteria that live in our intestines are going to outcompete it. It will never be able to cause an infection. However, it takes about a year for infants to develop their normal flora. And if you feed honey to a baby that hasn't been able to develop its normal flora, then it can develop this infant botulism. Now, botulism intoxication is when an individual encounters the actual toxin. The bacterium may not even be present anymore. They're just coming in contact with the toxin. And so we have foodborne botulism, which is the most common type, inhalation botulism, very rare. And then iatrogenic botulism, also very rare. This is when someone receives like a Botox injection and it's either not done properly or the dose is too high, and it can lead to symptoms associated with intoxication. So with foodborne botulism, this is unlike any other type of foodborne illness because the signs and symptoms are related to the nervous system. So botulinum toxin is a neurotoxin, just like tetanospasmin, the tetanus toxin. And what it does is it basically does the exact opposite of tetanus. Where tetanus causes muscle contraction and the body can't relax, botulinum toxin results in the inhibition of muscle contraction. So this time the muscles can't contract, so the muscles stay in this state of relaxation, and essentially the person, if they don't receive treatment, will suffocate to death because their diaphragm doesn't contract to allow air to flow into the lungs. It is the most acutely toxic substance known to date. It's about 1,000,000 times more potent than rattlesnake venom, so a very potent toxin. So in the United States in 2018, which was the last year that the CDC had data, there were 242 cases, the majority of those being infant botulism, okay, and then wound, and then foodborne. And a lot of cases of foodborne illness come from improperly canned foods. If you're canning your vegetables, you wash them, you clean them, you blanch them, and then you use a water bath or a pressure canner to seal them, and this prevents the spores from being able to germinate and then produce the toxin. And it has a similar appearance to Clostridium tetani. So listeriosis, caused by Listeria monocytogenes, it survives in the cold. It's a not really a psychrophile. It's psychrotolerant, and so it's often associated with things like hot dogs. And for most people, they're not going to have any problems. But pregnant women, it can cross the placenta, can cause damage to the developing fetus. It can also cause miscarriage. Newborns, the elderly, and immunocompromised. So normal, healthy adults really don't have any problems with this listeriosis. Really, pregnant women are the most at risk. And that's why, when you get pregnant, you go to the doctor and they give you a list of foods that you can't eat. And part of that is due to listeria. Something that we don't really hear about anymore, but that's been around for a long time. I mean, there's documented cases of leprosy dating back to, biblical times. Leprosy is still around. It does still exist. And you see here, there were a little more than 200,000 cases in 2019. Leprosy is caused by Mycobacterium leprae, which is closely related to Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which causes TB. It can live in armadillos. 95% of the population have a natural immunity to it. So there are very few people in the population that are susceptible, but this is a central nervous system disease because it destroys neurons of the peripheral nervous system. It leads to progressive demyelination. So that myelin sheath that I was talking about that surrounds nerves basically is going to be destroyed. So it's going to destroy nerves, and it leads to ulcers and deformities and fractures in the lepromatous form. So this is a stain here, an acid-fast stain, and all of these little red bacteria here are the Mycobacterium leprae. Now, tuberculoid leprosy is the least serious form. It's going to kind of result in these patches here. And these would be, there may be some neuropathy associated here. There may be some numbness that is associated with these nodules. But lepromatous leprosy is the disfiguring form of leprosy. This is, kind of what we think of when we think about leprosy. Now switching to our viral diseases of the nervous system. Our first group are the arthropod-borne encephalitis infections. And most of the time, these are asymptomatic or very mild. High fever, chills, very flu-like symptoms. But if it gets to what they refer to as a neuroinvasive disease, that's when we see the encephalitis and the complications that result in that. Mosquitoes are the vectors for these. There are no specific antiviral drugs. It's mostly just supportive care. So in the United States, we have four types of arboviral, or four main types of arboviral encephalitis. There are others. but these are the main four: Eastern equine encephalitis, Western equine encephalitis, St. Louis encephalitis, and West Nile encephalitis. They're all transmitted by mosquitoes. Eastern equine is really, in the United States, the most severe form, really. And in fact, I guess it's probably been 7 or 8 years ago now, there was a high school student that lived down around the Ben Lomond area that contracted Eastern equine encephalitis and died from it. So it's not, with a lot of these, it really doesn't matter your underlying health condition. People that are in good, healthy condition can develop severe symptoms of these. The natural reservoir for these are birds. Horses and humans are kind of accidental hosts of these. So Eastern equine encephalitis, here's that one case that occurred. You see, this is from 2010 to 2019, really not that many cases overall. Here's SLE cases. And then we get to West Nile. Now, this is just in 2021 so far. So West Nile virus, still the most prevalent one that we see in the United States. Zika came on the scene several years ago. We had not really had to worry about this very much in the Americas. But then when the Olympics were going on in Rio, and I guess it was 2016, they were seeing infections of Zika there. People were bringing it back to the United States with them. The issue really with Zika is infections in pregnant women, because it results in a birth defect called microcephaly, where the child has a smaller than normal head size, which results in brain damage. The other really unique one about this one is that it can be transmitted through sexual contact. This is not something that we see with other arboviral diseases. Now, Zika has not been transmitted locally in the United States since 2017. In 2016, we had local transmission in Florida. In 2017, there was local transmission in Florida and Texas. Now, there have been imported cases. There were no imported cases reported in 2020 and 2021. There were some, very few in 2019. Another viral condition we have here is rabies. Now, fortunately, in the United States, this is very, very rare in humans. There have only been about 25 cases reported in the last 10, 15 years. So we don't really see this very often. During 2019, there were almost 5,000 cases of rabies in animals. There is an active immunization that can be administered post-exposure, days 0, 3, 7, and 14 after infection. So if an individual is bitten by an animal that might have rabies, then they're given this immunization. There is no treatment once the signs and symptoms appear. It's got almost a 100% mortality rate, even with, treatment. Not without the post-exposure prophylactics, but even with treatment. Death usually results within 3 weeks to a month or so. Now, previously, to definitively diagnose rabies, it had to be done on autopsy, and these are brain cells, and they have this inclusion in them called a Negri body. Now, in the United States, there are several animal vectors. Of course, you see bats everywhere. In our area, skunks are those that tend to be or tend to cause most cases of rabies. You see along the East Coast, it's the raccoon. Out west and in Alaska, it's the fox. And then in Puerto Rico, and even though it's not shown here, Hawaii has mongooses. And so those could transmit rabies as well. Polio, fortunately, polio is not something that we really have to worry about in the United States anymore, and it is on track for global eradication. They had set a target of 2,000. We didn't make that, but we're close. There were 175 cases of wild type polio reported in 2019. There is still ongoing cases of vaccine acquired polio. In the United States, we use the inactive polio vaccine. But a lot of places around the world still use the oral polio vaccine. The oral polio vaccine is a live virus, and so sometimes it can mutate and cause disease. So we do still have vaccine acquired polio, but that's also something that they are working on. And it's the reason why in the United States we only use the inactive polio vaccine. We did use the oral polio vaccine for a long time. I remember as a kid getting the oral polio vaccine. They would come into the room, and I remember being at the doctor's office and them having this little vial of stuff that I had to drink. And it did not taste good. But fortunately, because it does only affect humans, we will be able to eradicate this one just like we did smallpox. Most cases of polio, about 75% of infections of polio are asymptomatic, and then the majority of the remainder are minor polio. It's the paralytic polio, which is less than 1% of infections, that really scared parents when, polio kind of came onto the scene in the 40s and 50s. And paralysis could be lifelong. Patients who did experience paralysis as it related to the respiratory system were kept alive in these iron lungs that basically set up a pressure system inside here that still let the lungs inflate. Now, getting to our protozoan diseases of the nervous system, the first one we have here is primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. This is caused by Nigleria Falera. What happens is someone's swimming around in a lake and they get water up their nose that contains the trophozoites, and they invade the nasal mucosa, make their way up to the central nervous system, leads to headache, fever, and then it starts to destroy brain tissue, leading to hemorrhage, coma, and death. Fatality rate's over 99%. There's only been a couple of individuals that have survived this. This is one of my favorite pictures of a pathogen. This is a scanning micrograph image of Nigleria Falera, and these little, what look like eyes and a mouth here, are sucking discs. Here is Nigleria shown in blood tissue. You've got neutrophils, or these cells here, got a red blood cell there, and then here is the Nigleria cell there. Another amoebic infection is Granulomatous amoebic encephalitis, caused by Acanthamoe, which can also cause eye infections, and Balamuthia. Almost always fatal again, because the lesions start to develop. So here you can see all these red areas here. These are hemorrhages within the brain, and then this right here is basically just destruction of the brain tissue from the lesions here. African sleeping sickness, also called African trypanosomiasis or human African trypanosomiasis, is caused by Trypanosoma brucei, and the vector for this is the tsetse fly. The wound from the fly becomes necrotic, and then the individual will develop what's called Winterbottom sign, which is inflamed lymph nodes in the cervical region. And then early symptoms that are kind of flu-like. And then once the central nervous system has been invaded, it results in a meningoencephalitis, and it causes extreme drowsiness, and that's where it takes its name, African sleeping sickness. Now, before the central nervous system is involved, pentam and suramin can be used for treatment. But once the central nervous system is involved, have to go to some pretty hefty drugs here. It's pretty much always fatal without treatment. Here's a scanning electron micrograph of blood. So you see your red blood cells, and then these little worm-looking structures here are the trypanosomes. Here's the tsetse fly. And this is what the bite would look like, okay? And so you can see here, this red streaking, this is lymphangitis. This is inflammation of the lymphatic vessels going here to the lymph nodes under the arm here. It is a very complicated life cycle. The tsetse fly is a biological vector because replication takes place within the tsetse fly. This is something else that is on track or for attempted eradication. This was cases reported in 2016. You see there, Central Africa still had more than 1,000 cases, but this is something, there's been about a 68% reduction in the number of cases. And so we're really working hard to eradicate this one as well. The problem with eradicating these vector-borne diseases, though, is the vector is still going to be around. That's the problem we have with any type of, mosquito-borne disease, because in order to completely eradicate it, you have to get rid of all of the infected vectors as well. So that brings us to the end of chapter 26 and the end of our chapters on pathogens.